This is Burlington, and here we are in the CCTV Channel 17 newsroom, and the ongoing conversation is called the Nuclear-Free Future Conversation. And viewers, I'd like you to welcome with me our guests, Maggie Gunderson, the president and founder of Fairewinds Energy Education Associates. And next to her is Arnie Gunderson, the chief engineer for Fairewinds Energy Education Associates. And our guest today is Mark Pendergrast, who is the author of a book called Japan's Tipping Point: Crucial Choices in the Post-Fukushima World. And we have set ourselves the topic question today: does Japan have a nuclear-free future? And this past weekend, something monumental, earth-shattering has happened, and that is...
Well, Japan has had a nuclear power plant operating in one form or another for the last 50 years, the last 5 decades. And for the first time in 5 decades, this weekend, no nuclear plants are running in Japan. 54 nuclear plants are now shut down. Obviously, there's the ones at Fukushima, but the Fukushima fallout, the political fallout, not the radiation fallout, has caused each individual state that has nuclear power plants to refuse to allow those plants to start back up. So this isn't like Vermont, where the federal government has the final authority. In Japan, when a plant shuts back down, it has to have permission from the state to start back up, and nobody's given permission now.
And when this last nuclear power plant was closed down, was it closed down for a particular reason?
No, they've all been shut down as they run out of fuel and they need to be refueled. They shut down, but then the state governors are not allowing them to start back up.
So ordinarily, before the Fukushima disaster, this would have been a routine process, right?
Yeah, there's 54 plants in Japan, yeah. And that makes 35% of their power. Now, some are always shut down, but yeah, this was routine. They would shut down for refueling, ask permission, and it was always given.
But the problem is now they're not restarting any of them.
Yes. So we perhaps have reached what you call Japan's tipping point.
Well, I hope that they realize they've reached a tipping point. Right now, I'm afraid that they haven't really come to grips with what are we going to do. It's clear that the people of Japan are not comfortable relying on nuclear power, and that's why none of them are working at the moment. The government hasn't figured that out. Is that right, Arnie?
I would agree with that, too. I would agree with that. I read your book, and I thought it was so interesting that there were particular quotes from particular people within the government who aren't looking at any new paradigm. And yet all the viewers from Japan who write to us, call us, and I've met a number of people in the United States also who have come from Japan to visit or immigrate here, and they're clear. They don't want any more nuclear power. And yet the government does not seem to be looking at some of the renewable resources that you looked at when you were in Japan.
Well, I don't think that they are looking at them all that seriously. They did pass a feed-in tariff bill, which will begin to actually kick in July of this summer.
What is a feed-in tariff?
We have one here in Vermont, actually. We were the first state to have it. It's basically a subsidy for forms of renewable energy. The history of this for renewable energy in Japan is that they had a subsidy only for photovoltaic panels, for solar panels, up until 2005, at which time they were by far the dominant country producing and utilizing solar energy. They decided, well, we've had enough of that. We don't need to subsidize it anymore. And they stopped in 2005. By 2009, when they began to do it again, they were like making 10% of Germany and China and the United States had far surpassed them in solar panel production. So they finally passed legislation to subsidize all forms of renewable energy, wind, geothermal, a variety of sources, as of July. But it's very unclear as to whether TEPCO and the other electric utilities, the monopolies, there are 10 of them in Japan, are really going to let them accept a lot of renewable energy into their grid. So it remains to be seen whether this is going to have a big impact or not.
Well, one of the things you pointed out in your book, and Arnie has spoken about also, is the way the grid works in Japan, and it doesn't allow for any movement of electricity in the way we do it in the U.S. Could one of you speak to that?
Well, east to west, there's a phase difference. One side of the island's on 60 cycles, one side's on 50 cycles, so it's hard to get the east and the west to communicate. But as Mark said, these are monopolies, and they really don't want to share interconnections between the grid to have a full national grid. On an island the size of Japan, it's so eminently doable, but yet because they have 10 very powerful monopolies, it doesn't get done.
So we're not talking about a local control of the grid at all.
Or a government control.
Or a government control. It's
Right.
Again, a monopoly as also known as a corporation. Is that what it is?
Well, there's
Okay.
also this, there's sort of it's kind of like in the United States, only worse. The people from the electric monopolies, when they retire, then they go to become, in the Ministry of Industry, and vice versa. So there's this sort of revolving door. They're all tied together running the country. And they don't like renewable energy because renewable energy, such as wind, or it only works when the wind is going. If there's too much wind, it's a problem. If there's not enough wind, it's a problem. They don't like sun because sometimes the sun is not out. So they prefer nice, reliable baseline energy, which I understand, but as a matter of fact, they need to figure out how to take renewable energy into their grid, and the big problem is storage. Electricity, you can't store huge amounts of it. So it's a challenge, but they need to, I said that they were like the canary in the coal mine for the rest of the world. It's so clear in Japan that they have enormous opportunity to show the rest of the world how this can be done. And they have no fossil fuel of their own, so they're not going to use nuclear. This is the tipping point for the world, only a little bit early, and we're seeing it in Japan. So they have enormous geothermal potential. They have great wind potential, although it's challenging where they are. They could use different kinds of geothermal. There's closed-loop systems. There are many things that they could possibly do. They could certainly use, they have a lot of wood. They have a monoculture of cedar, which is causing everybody to be allergic.
Yeah.
And they have these masks that they wear.
Those cedar trees were not there before World War II. They imported those after the war. They wanted this more of a Western cultural look and spread those all over.
And there was another reason, right? Were you just getting to that, Mark, about why they planted the cedar trees?
Well, they had this idea that that they were going to have very cheap lumber. The Japanese cedar grow very quickly. It didn't turn out to be the case. They imported all this lumber. So now, let me tell you one of the things that I found astonishing here. This is just a story of the wood pellet factories. On the face of it, it would make sense that they would turn the wood into wood pellets to heat their homes. So the government has subsidized over 100 wood pellet plants, and I saw one of them in a very rural area. But it doesn't make any logical sense. Logic often has nothing to do with what they're doing, because they don't have a lumber industry to speak of, so they don't make very much sawdust. So instead of making wood stoves, such as we have here in Vermont, which would make a lot of sense to burn their wood, they are turning it into they're turning it into sawdust artificially. And how they're doing that? With a lot of fossil fuel. They're dragging it off the mountains, turning it into sawdust, compressing it with more fossil fuel, and then they're trying to sell it, only nobody's buying the wood pellet stoves because they cost a fortune and they're made in Germany. So very few people, so they have these plants that are working at half capacity and don't have any market, rather than to produce efficient but cheap wood stoves that you could use in your home. So a lot of what they do doesn't make any sense.
Well, this is a fascinating book, and you were there, for our viewers, information, you were there for 6 weeks, and you kept focused on the clean energy issue there.
I got a grant to go there. It just happened that I was appearing there 2 months to the day after the tsunami, or the earthquake, and the nuclear meltdown. So it couldn't have been better timing for me in terms of what I was looking at, which was their, quote, eco-model cities program and all of the different forms of renewable energy. And it was very clear to me that they were not forging ahead the way that I had thought they would be. I went over there quite naive. I thought, oh, they must be doing all these wonderful things because they know they don't have any fossil fuel. But it turns out that they were relying very much on nuclear power. And then suddenly they didn't know what they were going to do. And I don't think they have figured out what they're doing.
And you went at a time that was really good because the food chain wasn't yet contaminated like it is now. You were eating last year's rice crop, last year's green tea, last year's vegetables, because they're showing inordinate amounts of contamination from radioactivity in food throughout the country now.
It's frightening.
It is frightening.
What did you eat when you were there?
Only food from southern Japan and south of Tokyo, and also some from Australia. I wouldn't eat northern Japanese food. Yeah.
Well, I was fortunate in that my itinerary was all south of Tokyo. It just happened that that's what I had planned to do, so that's where I went to.
You're very lucky.
Yeah, and Arnie, could you just remind us, on your website, on Fairewinds, you had something about the soil, the contamination of the soil from Fukushima, the latest on that. Could you just tell us what that is, please?
Well, I went to Tokyo back in February and took some soil samples. One a day for the 5 days I was there, in no particular locations that stood out, crack in the sidewalk right across from the Supreme Court, and then had those all sampled at a lab here in the United States. Brought them back through customs and declared them as radioactive dirt and brought them through. And the lab here determined that all of them would be treated as radioactive waste if it had been in the United States. It's interesting because in the United States, we haven't even blinked after Fukushima. We continue to operate all our nuclear plants. But I tried to bring the message home on the website about that issue. Here's Tokyo, the capital of Japan, about 150 miles away from the reactor. And its dirt is contaminated as if it were radioactive waste. Now, outside of Washington, D.C., there's about a dozen nuclear reactors within 100 miles. And yet we seem to think it can't happen here. But in fact, it could. Yeah. That was the point I was trying to make when we put that video up on the website. Can I talk to the fuel cycle for a minute?
Of course.
Yeah. How did Japan get into this? Mark said they don't have oil, they don't have coal, and they don't have uranium. But they bought into the concept of a nuclear fuel cycle, which meant they would buy uranium somewhere, but then they would never have to buy it again because they believed that once they used it in their nuclear reactors, they could reprocess it, run it through a thing called a breeder reactor, and actually create more plutonium than they used. So they viewed this as a closed cycle. They never thought they'd have any waste. And on an island that's so seismic, where would you put the waste at the end of the cycle? So institutionally, the Japanese have bought into this closed fuel cycle. Fukushima was the beginning of that fuel cycle. The burner reactors like Fukushima were the first part.
Daiichi?
The Fukushima Daiichi was the beginning of it. The next part doesn't work. The Japanese have yet to get reprocessing working. And then the third piece of this is this fast breeder reactor. The Japanese have one that ran 1 year in the last 30 and had a huge fire. It's cooled by liquid sodium, which explodes when it touches air. So they keep subsidizing this myth, the myth that they can close the cycle, putting enormous money into it. Yet at the same time, like Mark said, they're removing the subsidies from solar. Makes no sense to me.
Mark, could you tell us something about the METI, M-E-T-I, and their control of the energy in Japan?
METI stands for Ministry of Economy, Trade, and Industry, and they're the most powerful industry in Japan, whereas, for instance, the Environmental Ministry has not nearly the budget or the money. And METI nowadays is at least giving lip service to sustainability, and the big new word is smart energy, smart grid. But if you look carefully at what they're doing, I'm afraid they really haven't changed a whole lot in terms of what they're focusing on. And I think Arnie's point of what are you subsidizing and what are you aiming at is hugely important. So they, I don't want to paint this totally negative picture of Japan, though. If I could, I'd like to kind of make a point. They're doing some really interesting things, and there's some very smart people there. There's a guy named Tetsunari Iida, I-I-D-A, who runs something called ICEP, the Institute for Sustainable Energy Practices. Did you meet him when you were over there? Did you?
No.
Yeah.
I tried to, but we couldn't meet.
He's sort of like you. He's a former nuclear engineer who got disaffected and who's become the gadfly for the nuclear industry. And he has a plan for how renewable energy could take over from all other forms of energy by the year 2050 in Japan. Now, I'm not convinced that it can be done as easily as he thinks without changing their lifestyle substantially. And I think we're going to have to change our lifestyles substantially in the coming years because of global warming, because of, fracking is a whole other issue that I'm unhappy with. But I think that we need to face the fact that regardless of whether we destroy everything underground in order to get fossil fuel out, it's a limited time thing. We're not going to be able to rely on fossil fuel, at least our great-grandchildren won't. So what are we going to do? So, and there are some solutions. Certainly, if I could just run down a little bit of the different things that Japan is facing. It's ironic that all of these nuclear power plants are by the ocean because they need so much water. Well, that's exactly where they could be building wind turbines. Right. They already have the infrastructure to get if you put the wind turbines way up on top of a mountain, that's a problem because getting the electricity down from that mountain and into the grid is hard. They've already got the grid with all the nuclear power plants, so why not really push for wind power? They do have these, huge typhoons and tsunamis, so they have to build them very solidly. But Mitsubishi, for instance, is actually quite good at doing that with their wind turbines. Geothermal. One of the reasons it's insane for them to rely on nuclear power is that they're sitting on top of all these faults. They have earthquakes all the time, which is how all of this started.
Could you just give us a brief explanation of how geothermal is connected to the faults for our viewers?
Sure. The tectonic plates are crashing up against each other, And it allows deep down in the earth, it's very, very hot. And so just a very simple thing, where the tectonic plates are coming together, where you have earthquakes, is also where you have geysers and hot things coming out of the ground all by themselves. So there's a lot of places where that's true.
The example is Mount Fuji. The symbol of Japan is, in fact, an active volcano. They have about 20.
Yeah, yeah. So, but the problem is that about 80% of their potential sites are inside their national parks. So they're talking about, they don't want to do that. I understand they don't want to do that. But if you look at the larger picture of things, I'm afraid they really should do, allow some exceptions. Otherwise, they're talking about drilling sideways in from the edge of the parks and trying to get it at the geothermal energy that way. So they are facing issues, but they're things that they could overcome. I mean, I interviewed a guy whose specialty is geothermal energy, and he told me that, there were like 20 or 40 people, I can't remember how many, in his department 15, 20 years ago. Now there's something like 3 left because they've defunded them and they have no power. He can't make any decisions. So it's not like there aren't a lot of interesting things happening. The one other thing let me mention is their traditional way of building. Everybody told me, oh, the Japanese, they build like their houses will only last 20 years and then they tear them down. So that's why they don't have very good insulation. That's why they don't have double pane windows, things like that. Well, that turns out not to be true. It's true for after World War II. But they built very sustainably for hundreds of years before being influenced by the West. And they're a form of housing called machiya that a few of them still remain, particularly in Kyoto, that have natural circulation in the summer, that are pretty well insulated because they're right next to each other, one direction, and their sort of clay and wattle construction isn't bad. So I actually went to somebody's house, a machiya that she had renovated, and it's beautiful. It's a beautiful place, and they could be doing this, but instead they're building these monstrosities called, quote, mansions, which are condominiums with very little insulation. So they continue to one thing they could do would be to have something like Efficiency Vermont, which comes in and tells you where are you losing energy in your buildings, and this is how you should, and they subsidize that here. They should subsidize it there. They're very good in Japan with energy conservation for big business.
Like Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Toyota.
Like many, or like the paper industry was a terrible waster of energy. And they realized that they had to do something about that following the energy crises of the 1970s. But they've never addressed the residential area at all, as far as I know.
Arnie found that when he and our daughter went to Japan, it was so hot in any of the office buildings. It was 80 degrees and in the winter.
In February, it was 82 degrees in the office buildings. I understand 82 in the summer, but in the winter they just have the heat cranked up.
And in the summer, my understanding is they had gotten very accustomed, like Florida, to very heavy air conditioning. Of very cold, you needed to put on a sweater then. You have to reverse that paradigm, put on a sweater in the winter, dress warmly, and dress lightly in the summer, and change that paradigm. I mean, it's a huge, and insulation, as you're saying, in those buildings would make a huge difference.
Well, one of the things they have something now called Cool Biz. I said, what does Cool Biz mean? And they spell it in English. It turns out that it means that, we're not going to turn up the air conditioning so much in the summer, which is why it's so hot when you went over. And we're going to let people not wear coats and ties. We're going to let them wear short-sleeve shirts or something. But that's not a long-term solution.
Well, they're channeling President Jimmy Carter's "Put on your sweater" from the 1970s.
Well, when Arnie was there, it was February, and they had it 82 in February inside. And
it's way too hot.
Way too
And of course, you know, the image everybody has of Tokyo is incredible lights on the streets. You could read a book if half the lights were blown out. You could still read a book on the streets in Tokyo. It's so incredibly bright. Wherever I went, I saw waste. And I feel bad. I mean, certainly as an American, we have no right to tell these people that they're wasting energy and we're not. I mean, America's per capita energy consumption is worse than the Japanese. So we wind up in a situation where you wind up preaching to someone who really is doing a better job.
Yeah, I saw the same thing. I mean, you go in Tokyo and you see these gigantic television screens up on the sides of buildings. You walk past pachinko parlors that are incredibly loud and the lights are going off. And this was 2 months after the disaster. And I thought, you know, you could certainly, or they have vending machines for everything all over the place. And they're a tremendous waster of energy, so they do that. Can I show, I have a problem. I have this huge PowerPoint that I brought, and I realize it's going to take too long to go through the thing, but I wanted to show a few select things.
Oh, we would love that. Yes, please do.
They told me that if I told them to show it, that they could show one. So I'll just periodically, that's why I'm fiddling over here. It's not like I'm not paying attention. But can you show this particular one? I went to, they have an Eco Model City program, which I found they had instituted in 2008 because the G8 summit was being held there, and they basically wanted, it's a window dressing program, unfortunately, by and large. But some of these towns really were taking it seriously, and one of them was Kitakyushu, which is sort of like what Pittsburgh used to be. It was their big steel town. And I was impressed, you know, with what they were trying to do. And one of the things they were doing were these electric bicycles. And you can check them out from anywhere in town for very little money. And their batteries are charged by this range of solar panels that's on top. So it's a very sustainable way to get around town. And then you can trade them in different places and get batteries. And that's the kind of thing that I think is very innovative and that we should be doing here as well.
Mark, when do they start that? When do they start to rebuild the old steel city there?
Oh, that's a great story, actually. You must have read that in the book.
Yes.
It was in the 1960s. The women, the wives of the steelworkers, were so distraught by the fact that they couldn't get the clothes to stay clean. They couldn't even see the sky. In fact, so they made a documentary using handheld cameras called "We Want Our Blue Sky Back" or something like that. And this was the beginning of the environmental movement in Japan. And they cleaned up that city. The bay there was called the Bay of Death because no fish could live in it, and you certainly didn't want to swim in it. Now you can swim in it, and you can catch fish out of it. So they have really come a long way. And Kitakyushu has a number of very innovative programs. They have a recycling area on a landfill. They have a lot of wind power there on that same site. But again, they're also doing some things I thought were not sustainable because hydrogen is a byproduct of making steel. They're powering a few things with fuel cells using hydrogen, but I don't see this as it just happens that they're making this hydrogen. In order to make hydrogen artificially, you have to use a great deal of energy to separate, if you're going to hydrolyze water or something like that. So they're doing some things. Oh, they had me ride a bicycle, speaking of bikes, that was hydrogen powered. It was hugely expensive. I can't remember how much it cost, probably $50,000
Oh my gosh.
for this bicycle. And it was very, very heavy. And it was just silly. It was a toy. So those things. Oh, I'll tell you another wonderful story from there.
Okay.
I went to they have a nature trail, and they had a Segway machine, where you stand on the machine. And I said, "What's that doing there?" "Oh, we have that for people who go on the nature walks." so they can ride the Segways. It sort of defeats the purpose of walking.
I love that picture in your book of the path of tranquility. That's so beautiful. In that, I guess you
I
can't
liked
show that there.
Yeah, I went to a little tiny town called Usahara. It reminded me a lot of Vermont. It looked like Vermont. And they have something they call a therapy trail, which is, the idea is to take people who are mentally depressed and take them up into this beautiful area and walk along a nature trail. It's true. I mean, you know, we should start selling therapy trails here on for the long trail.
You know, the role of women is fascinating in Japan. We're seeing in Japan now, it's the women who have taken the forefront in weaning the country from nuclear power. The men quite frequently are saying, well, the government says it's good, therefore it must be good. And whereas the women who are, in addition to their personal concerns as mothers are worried about their children, have taken the lead and are saying, we don't want nuclear power. And if you look at the big demonstrations and all, certainly there are men there, and I don't mean to minimize that, but the movement got its momentum because the women in Japan have taken control. That's significant for that culture, because in general the women are not expected to take a leadership role like that. It's really exciting.
Yes, and this past weekend there have been enormous demonstrations of support for the end of nuclear power in Japan. In Japan, the demonstrations have been in Japan and supporting
that.
Yes, yeah, and it's interesting to see how the headlines or the media cover it here. You know, they'll say the last nuclear power plant is closed down, and then they'll say, but what about when summer comes? What about when the heat comes? And so there's always the caveat that this is not a good thing. And I just want to, not to take a detour in this, but to cite the editorial in today's New York Times.
The end of clean energy subsidies?
Well, yes. Yet this productive, it's about how nuclear is clean energy. Again, they're saying in this editorial that nuclear power is clean energy.
What they mean is that it's not adding to the carbon footprint, but it's certainly not clean.
But it is adding to the carbon footprint immensely, because in making the nuclear fuel, for example, it's Paducah, Kentucky, where one of the fabrication plants is located, and it's using the dirtiest coal that we have anywhere in the country, and it uses huge amounts, and huge amounts of fossil fuels are used in the mining process. Mm-hmm. And none of that is ever figured in. None of the waste disposal is figured into the cost of nuclear or its carbon footprint, or how all of that's going to be combined in the equipment used to take apart a nuclear site and move the waste, and none of that is anywhere figured into the footprint. And when you do, their carbon footprint is quite high.
A friend of mine is Peter Bradford, who's a former NRC commissioner and former chair of the Public Service Commission in New York. And I think he sums up the nuclear issue and subsidies and global warming the best I've ever heard. He said, trying to solve global warming by building nuclear plants is like trying to solve global hunger by serving everyone caviar.
Very good point.
Very good point,
Yeah,
yes.
And your point about the carbon footprint is, I've never heard that expressed so succinctly and so well.
Thank you. Well, I was thinking earlier, and I made a note to bring the discussion back to here, when you were talking about Japan's planning for the future and how they're looking that they can't do it without nuclear. Dr. Arjan Makajani, who's right outside of Washington, D.C., and he founded an organization called IEER.org. He has a book out, and it's free on his website. You can download it, or you can donate to the website and buy it. It's called Carbon Free and Nuclear Free, and it's a road plan that he made for energy planning in the U.S. He's a nuclear engineer. He's a physicist. He's a PhD. And he was an energy planner in the Carter administration. And he knows his stuff almost better than anyone in the world. And he answers a lot of the storage issues that you were talking about and transmission issues. I think what energy planners and engineers throughout the world need to do is get out of the box. Think outside the box. You have to start with, and this is what a lot of the women and mothers are asking for in Japan, start with the premise. There's no more nuclear because of the contamination. It's not worth risking children's lives. It's not worth risking inhabitable areas for generations upon generations. And therefore, get outside the box and let's, when you look at Japan and you look at the U.S., these are countries who have been leaders in technological growth. Are they saying now, whoops, we've hit our limit, we can't think any new ideas and we can only stick with oil and nuclear and gas fracking because we can't think any clearer, our minds are dead now? I don't buy that premise.
I think it's fascinating. The nuclear industry says if we spend enough money on it, we can figure out a way to store nuclear waste for 250,000 years. But they're also saying, well, you can't have solar and wind because we can't figure out a way of storing the electricity.
Right.
If we can store nuclear waste for 250,000 years, we can certainly figure out a way of taking out the ebbs and flows in an electric cycle.
And there are some ways. You can store water in it. You can pump water back up with renewable energy, and then use it to create more energy later. There are some ways. But one of the things you're saying, I wanted to give the example of solar hot water. You don't need to conserve that because it's direct. The sun heats the water. It's the oldest renewable energy technology we have that's been around for a long time. In Japan, hardly anyone uses it. And I found this astonishing. The reason that they're not using it is it became quite popular in the early 80s after the energy crisis. And the cheaper varieties don't require a pump. You can just use water where it's temperate, which most of Japan is, where it's not going to freeze. Then you can see the tank on somebody's roof. And it just circulates through gravity, and when it heats up, it comes back, it comes down, and it works very well.
And what generates the pump?
You don't need a pump for it.
The hot water is less dense than the cold water, so the density difference.
It works fine, as long as your water doesn't freeze. The other type, the one that I have on my roof now, for instance, you have to have an antifreeze in it, and you pump the antifreeze, and there's a heat exchange pump down in your house, which is it's a minimal expenditure. I love my hot water. But what happened was, people would see the tanks, so you could see somebody had that, and, quote, salespeople would come and tell people that they had to put chemicals in their tanks and basically they were con artists. And they would particularly pick on elderly people who had these systems, so they got a bad name. And then a lot of these companies were fly-by-night and went out of business. So now nobody wants solar hot water because it's supposed to be lower class and you can't trust the people who do them, which is mind-bogglingly doesn't make any sense. So in Tokyo, they're trying to give big subsidies for solar hot water because they know it makes sense. But trying to convince people to have it is difficult. So you have all these image problems and misperceptions.
Well, when we moved to Vermont, when we lived in Connecticut, we had a house that was amazing. It had active and passive solar, and it was built in the 1970s. And it was in exact same climate we're living in now, because being near the lake, it's moderated, and we're in the same zone, and because we're at the highest part of Connecticut, a mountaintop. And it was just during the day, I had to ask people if I was going to their homes or going out anywhere what the heat was, because the house was always at 80 in the winter from natural sunlight, from this and we didn't have water on the roof. It was a fan system, and there was water storage in the basement, and then we heated our hot water with it as well.
Wonderful.
So,
Yeah, this is not new technology. It's interesting. Union of Concerned Scientists has done a study where they looked at all the subsidies that have been put into nuclear over 70 years. And they've determined that if those subsidies would have raised nuclear's price by 5 cents. So the price of electricity from a nuclear plant is right now around 5. It should be 10, except that we, as taxpayers, have subsidized the industry for 70 years. So when I hear, well, you shouldn't subsidize solar, we're talking about a new technology versus a 70-year-old technology. I think there's a role for subsidies on new technology, but when something gets to be 70 years old, you either got it right or you shut it down.
Can I show another one of my little
Of course,
pictures here?
please, please do.
This is a rice seedlings about to be transplanted. I got there in early May, and so they were just about to plant their rice seedlings. Now, this just brings up a whole other issue of food. The Japanese import 60% of their food. They used to be totally self-sustaining, and they could be self-sustaining again. Over, I think, 40% of their rice paddies are lying fallow. They're not growing anything whatsoever now. Why? Because after World War II, the American occupation convinced them that eating rice wasn't really that good for you. What you wanted was wheat and bread. Rice was old-fashioned. So they don't eat nearly as much rice as they used to. One of the things they could do with those fallow rice paddies would be to grow a strain of rice that's meant for animal feed mostly, but it grows very, very quickly. It doesn't need pesticides. They could make biofuel out of it, but they're not. They're not doing anything with it. Let me just show you, let me just rip through this a second. This is the cedar that I told you about. And this was at the home of this wonderful couple. This is my favorite part of my whole trip. Let me see if I can find a picture of them. Ah, there he is. I had seen this couple in a documentary film made about 20 years ago. And they were struggling farmers, but they were hoping that their son, who was 15, was going to take over. Only he didn't, it turns out. I sought them out to find out what had happened. He's gone on and taken a job in the city. He got a degree in agriculture, but he's an agricultural bureaucrat. But now he has a 15-year-old son, and they're desperately hoping that he will take over this absolutely gorgeous farm. They are self-sustaining. So it's just a portrait of what is possible. This is, by the way, a hydroelectric plant, but it shows how that they see the big tank up there. The water is coming from a river on the other side of the mountain. They've drilled a tunnel through. So there's a lot of things that don't make a whole lot of sense about what they're doing, not just nuclear.
But at the same time, as you would write, that doesn't make any sense. You marvel at the fact that they drilled that tunnel and their expertise in so many technological things.
They're amazing.
So that
so if they can drill tunnels for that, they can certainly drill it for geothermal energy.
Exactly, and that's one of the major points you make. And well, addressing the question, does Japan have a nuclear-free future? I'm going to ask you to come back again, if you would, please. Mark, would you agree to come back again and
I would love to come back.
continue this conversation? And Arnie and Maggie, please
of course,
do.
yes.
But could you go to the ironies that you had written about in your book, so that we haven't answered this question completely? Does Japan have a nuclear-free future? I, for one, and the public who are watching, I hope so. And from what I've learned today and from the book, I believe that it is possible that it does.
Well, one of the things that touched me and why I loved Mark's book so much is he talks about how Japan can be a leader, a world leader. And, you know, they're on the cusp. That's the tipping point, that they can do something
And you know, one of the things that's been so frustrating to me about this book is it's not available in Japanese. And Arnie, you brought it over to your publisher, and I hope that they'll take a look at it. I haven't heard from them. But I desperately would like to get. It's a very short little book. If somebody in Japan is looking at this.
Well, I'm going to hold it up too, and to show people just what it looks like. I'm holding it in my hand, and I've been reading it on ebook myself and enjoying it very, very much. But this is the book itself. It's a small book, as they say in the back, on a huge topic. And the fact is that this book has not been reviewed in the major book reviews that I read all the time, like the New Yorker book reviews, the New York Times book reviews, the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books. Where are you? Where are you people who would look at this book and to learn something with all of us?
It is ironic, you know, they had the anniversary of the tsunami and of the meltdown, and I listened carefully to the news and I read the news. How much did you get interviewed for that?
Hardly.
Hardly at all.
Yeah.
No one called me. It's very bizarre.
Yeah. You know,
Well,
it's interesting.
Go ahead. No.
Our book is titled Fukushima Daiichi, The Truth, which is a discussion of the accident, and the way forward. The last chapter of our book talks about energy alternatives. And here's Mark, 5 miles away, and we don't know each other's book is in the process, writing about the same thing on a much larger scale. I just think it's amazing that here in Vermont we can, with clear eyes, look at Japan and by reference the United States, and realize that the system we have now is unsustainable, but there is alternatives.
Right.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for being
welcome.
with me,
You're welcome
Maggie
so
and
much.
Arnie. And Mark, come back again, please.
We'd
and
love to.
The books have to be Mark's book has to be translated into Japanese, and Arnie's book has to be translated into English.
Yes.
And we'll move forward into a nuclear-free future. Thank you, viewers, and thank guests for coming. Goodbye for now.